Tonight we're going to take two lesson texts again. We're going to use one verse and I'll just read it. But our primary focus is going to be found in Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 23 and going through verse 29. Our main text that I'm going to read is found in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. And here's what the Bible says about Moses, a very interesting statement. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. I want you to think about Moses, and I want you to think tonight about leaders. There are people that we consider to be, when we look at them, we just say, well, he's a natural born leader. Or she's a natural born leader. It can be both. It can be a woman who possesses the ability to lead others. It can be women she leads. It can be men sometimes that are influence leads. It can be certainly children in the household, her own or somebody else's. It can be a man who is a leader, who's in a place of prominence, a position of preeminence. Especially so in the church do we need, above all, good leaders, both men and women. They need to be people who can be respected, and they need to be people who fulfill their roles in the way that God defines that role be fulfilled. A woman has a role in the church. She needs to remember that role. She needs to be a good leader. A man has a role in the church. He can be just a man in the congregation. He can be a song leader. He can be a preacher. He can be an elder. He can be a deacon. A woman can be a Bible class teacher. There are many things that we can do. A woman can help in the role of leading when it comes to singing. Not in the sense that she's supposed to lead a song, but she certainly partakes of the song practice or the song during worship and allows her voice to be heard. And it's an encouragement to those around us, because we all teach when we sing. We teach and admonish one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with grace in our hearts unto the Lord. So singing is a form of teaching that we all participate in. But we were talking about Moses. Now, the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. That would make Moses, in my mind, a natural candidate to be what we would call a natural born leader. And so we turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We begin in verse 23 and we start learning about Moses, some more about Moses in Hebrews chapter 11 in a different way from what we learned about his life in the first 5 books of the Bible, or 4 of the first 5. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians assaying to do were drowned. Now, you read this about Moses, bear in mind that part of what developed Moses into the man that he was during the course of his young life was the fact that he was certainly taken by Pharaoh's daughter and taken out of the Nile River and raised as his own, as her own, but he was also taken back to his mother, who was there to nurse him and who was there to nurture him as he came along. So she had a great hand in developing the character of this man who we define as being a natural born leader. Because natural born leaders are not naturally born leaders. They bear certain character traits that can assist them, can cause them to develop into natural born leaders. They have certain character traits that cause them to be more willing to step out in the forefront. They have character traits that cause them to be more willing to stand and endure when times are hard. They have character traits that allow them to be influential of the people they come in contact with. They come with these natural traits, but they must be developed. They're not going to just automatically happen unless somebody prepares them in their lifetime to be such. It can be that somebody else prepares them. It can be that they want to lead themselves and they can seek to be prepared. They seek out the things that would best serve them. Last night I was watching something on television. It was about a gangster, a Whitey Bulger, I believe that's the way you pronounced his name, but anyhow, he was an Irish mob. He went to prison for bank robbery. He was a car thief and different things like that. And he robbed banks from the East Coast all the way down and finally got caught and served 20-year sentence in prison as a bank robber. He didn't serve all of that time, but he was sentenced to 20 years. And he began to educate himself. He wanted to be a leader in the Irish mob, and so he began to study. He began to read ferociously everything he could about different leaders in history. And he prepared himself to be a leader in the Irish mob. Was he a natural born leader? Well, he had the inclination, but his inclination was to do that which was wrong, but he wanted to be a leader of men. And so he became a prominent figure in the Irish mob. He was so corrupt that he connected with an FBI agent. He actually became an informant for the FBI while he carried on his criminal career, which included murdering no telling how many people. Leaders are developed. Good, bad, or indifferent, they are developed. Moses was a man who was different. He was meek above all men which were upon the face of the earth. He had an attitude of meekness, which meant a lot. It meant that Moses was an humble man. And so Moses was prepared early on by his mother to do the job that he had to do even in Egypt. He's recorded in the Bible as being God's great leader, a man so great that when God took him up into Mount Nebo to allow him to spy out the land or see the land for himself, he wouldn't allow him to go in because he had transgressed God's command. He had struck the rock when God had told him only to speak to it. His punishment was that he could see the land, but he could not dwell in it. He was such a leader and so well renowned as a leader that he died there at the age of 120. His physical characteristics had not changed. He had maintained his strength and integrity of his youth even until he was 120 years old. He died there and was buried by the angels so that no man would know to this day where Moses is buried, lest the children of Israel set up a shrine and worship Moses instead of God. There's a great leader. Wouldn't you agree? I think about a man like Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people don't know it, but Lincoln, who was assassinated, of course, in 1865, was buried. They toured the United States with his body for about a month. And they kept embalming him over and over and over and over again so that his physical traits would stay the same. He wouldn't decay too much. And in about 1915, I'm not sure the year exactly, some guys decided that they would take Abraham Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom. And so they tried to break in. They were caught. They were put in jail, but they had disturbed the casket or the place where he was at so much that they decided to open it up and be sure the body was still intact. When they opened it up, his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was there. And he looked upon his dad, and his dad looked exactly as he did the day they closed the casket. They had embalmed him so much, except that he had a copper color all over his skin. But they noticed that on his suit were some little tiny flakes of red, white, and blue on the jacket. And they couldn't figure out what that was. And somebody remembered that before they closed the casket for the last time, a small boy in Springfield, Illinois, had taken and placed a small flag on Lincoln's chest before they closed the casket, and that flag had deteriorated. But to prevent them from stealing his body once again, they took him back and they buried him under 16 or 17 feet of concrete. That's a great leader. So valuable that somebody would steal his body 50 years after his death and hold it for ransom. Now, that explains a lot about why God had the angels bury Moses so that no man would dare know where he is buried to this day. But Moses, even as a leader that his mother had prepared, when it started time for his mission with God, he started out reluctantly. And it's natural that he would do so because Moses knew himself perhaps better than anybody else. He saw some character flaws. He said, I'm of slow speech. But there's another thing about Moses that shows he wasn't quite ready to lead. And God knew he wasn't ready to lead, even though God had called on him to go and be a leader. One thing is, his reactions to situations were sometimes sudden. When he saw one of his kinsmen, one of his brethren, being mistreated by an Egyptian, instead of breaking it up, what did he do? He killed the Egyptian. That's a rash act. It caused him to have to flee the land of Egypt because he acted suddenly. So he was quick to react in a situation. Good leaders sometimes don't give an answer right now. We're oftentimes asked many questions in the course of our life, and I found as I get older and older and older, I'm slower to answer than I used to be. You know how the old guys were, Philip, when you'd ask them something, they'd sit there and they'd ponder on it a little bit, and they'd look around and they didn't say anything for a while. And then finally, later on, they might say something. But what they say didn't really answer your question in the way you wanted it answered. It answered it in a way to make you understand. A friend of mine told me one time when he first got married to his wife, that him and his father-in-law were driving to town, and he thought his father-in-law was fairly wealthy. And they were driving to town in an old beat-up truck, and so they went by a new car lot out there, and there sat a brand new GMC truck. And he looked at his father-in-law and he said, Mr. So-and-so, I think if I had your money, I'd buy one of those pickups. And he said his old father-in-law didn't say a word, and said they drove about 20 more miles down, and finally his father-in-law never looked up at him at all, but just kept driving. He said, son, I think I know more about my money than you do. There's the way you answer a fool according to his folly. That's what the Bible teaches us to do. Answer a fool according to his folly. Answer not a fool according to his folly. Wisdom decides. Wisdom reflects. Wisdom thinks. Good leaders think before they respond. If we just react to a situation, oftentimes what do? We simply make it worse than it already is. So Moses was a man who was quick in reacting to a situation. His sudden reactions did not come by deliberate choice because they were not well planned. He just, in the spur of the moment, killed that Egyptian, not thinking about the consequences, and he did something in haste, hoping it would have a good outcome, but it didn't. So the very next day, when he tries to break up an argument between some of his brethren, some of his kinsmen, they say, wilt thou kill me as you did the Egyptian? He didn't know this thing was known by so many people, but it was. He had reacted instead of responding. If he had had a good outcome, when we react to a situation and we have a good outcome, it's only an accident. It's not because I planned it that way. It just happened to work out that way by chance. Good leaders, male or female, do not depend on luck to have a good outcome. They think about things. We have to reflect on things so that we can have the best possible outcome for each and every situation. When you count on luck, the luck of the draw is usually against you. Why do you think casinos are able to make so much money? Because very few people are lucky. They've already thought about the outcome. They know what the result is going to be. The game is rigged against you. It's not dishonest. It's just rigged against you. And so you're depending your future fortune on something that's nothing but luck. And very few people in life continue to be lucky. We're oftentimes like the old dog. I saw a cartoon one time, a caricature of a dog. It was a picture of a dog that was hanging on a light pole in that drawing. And it said, missing dog. It said, one eye, one ear, short tail, 3 legs. It said he answers to the name of Lucky. Well, that's how lucky we are. Just that lucky. We just happen to get away with it. Is all it is. Good leaders don't make choices like that. Good leaders examine the outcome far down the road. And they think ahead, okay, what's this going to mean here and here and here? When we seek only an immediate relief in a situation, that is not a solution. It just is immediate relief. We've got to go beyond that. Good leaders make good choices based on experiences they have learned with the passing of time. And instant gratification in every situation, without exception, seldom brings long-term rewards. So we stop and we think. Moses, the man Moses, was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. When he was come to years, 40 years old, and he left Egypt. He became a leader in time, but he's still not ready. He's got 40 years of his life out of the way, and he's still not ready. What do we think about somebody 40 years old? Well, it depends on who you asked. Somebody 40 says, I'm in the prime, right? Somebody 15 says, you're an old man. Somebody 40 says, I'm at the best place I've ever been. Somebody 15 says, you're an old lady. It all depends on where we're at, doesn't it? When I look at somebody 40, I see a youngster. But I remember when I was 40, I didn't think I was so young. 40 years old. Now he's come to years. When he was come to years, he's made a rational decision, but he's still got some work to do. He leaves Egypt. In Egypt, he's the adopted son of Pharaoh. He's learned the responsibilities that go with being a leader. He was a prince in Egypt. So he had learned a lot of responsibilities. He'd learned how to be a man of war, no doubt. He had learned battle tactics, no doubt. He had learned the tactics that go with ruling an empire. They had prepared him to rule, but yet he's not yet ready to rule in God's kingdom. And so he leaves Egypt. He fled to Midian. Now he's going to begin a second phase, and we've talked a lot over the years about the three phases of Moses' life. Now he's ready to go to Midian, and now he's going to learn a valuable lesson. He's going to have to learn how to do something besides lead. What's he going to learn? He's going to all of a sudden learn how to serve. Can you imagine being royalty in Egypt as he was? And having to go to Midian, and now he serves his father-in-law Jethro. He's a part of Jethro's house. What does Jethro have for him to do? Well, he's a great leader. I got to be able to do something with him. What does he have him do? He has him 10 flocks. And now he's a shepherd learning another important, valuable step in his life. He's learning how to guide a flock. No doubt a very humble occupation. No doubt an occupation where you had a lot of time to do some serious thinking and to learn some different kind of life lessons than you would learn from being a leader. He's out there in the fields. He's out there in the fields by day. He's out there in the fields, no doubt, by night. And he's tending the sheep. Do you remember in the late 1800s, if you've seen movies or you've read anything about it, the great cattle wars and sheep herd wars that took place in the late 1800s over the grazing rights to different land? Go back and study that history. It's pretty neat. You read about a man named, what was his name? Tom Horn? Is that his name? I believe so. Who was hired by the ranchers to go in and get rid of the sheep herders and to get rid of the cattle rustlers. And so his job was to go out and get them out of there, whatever it took. And he ended up killing several of them. And he was finally hanged for murder in 1901 when a 13-year-old boy was shot off the fence who was herding some sheep or guiding some sheep. Those were rough times. But imagine the loneliness of that place and the danger that took place with that, because he's guarding something that cannot protect itself. It was an occupation that was demanding of his time, his attention, a sacrifice certainly of his comfort, but it was necessary for him to learn these things because in the process it taught him something that every good leader needs to understand, and that is compassion. You cannot be a good leader if you do not know and understand the word compassion. Because compassion has to do with our ability to lead in the caring for of the needs of others. Do you know how many people there are in this world who have absolutely no compassion? Even in our society today. Our society today is perhaps more civilized in terms of the generations we've lived through than it ever has been at any other time in the history of our world. But don't kid yourself. The world is still filled with plenty of folks who have no sense of compassion. They have no concern for their fellow man. They wouldn't think twice about taking your life if they thought they could get away with it. They won't think twice of taking everything you have if they think they can get away with it. They are lack and void of compassion. The fact that we still have folks in our country today who, when we pick up the paper or turn on the news, we find somebody has dumped a baby in a dumpster somewhere or rolled them up a sack and thrown them in a pile of garbage as if they are nothing. Do you think that is an act of compassion? Or somebody who finds themselves pregnant, instead of facing the consequences of their actions, says, I just know what I'll do, I'll get rid of it. Is that an act of compassion? A society that condones such conduct, are those people of compassion? We cannot have leaders, good leaders, who are void of compassion. And I'm talking about in the church. We're not going to have that in the world. Thank you so much. As a general whole, that's not going to be the case of society, no matter where you go in society, because people that work their way up in that line, in that realm, go for the power. And they're going to do whatever they've got to maintain the power. If it means starting a war, if it means killing whoever, it's going to be. And they're going to feed back the hand that fed them, and that means they're going to allow them to make whatever dollars they can through whatever means is available, and sometimes that's war, sometimes that's destruction, sometimes that's the handing over of our freedoms by causing us to be taxed end on end to pay back these political favors. That's not compassion. I'm talking about the kind of compassion that feeds the nation that belongs to God. I'm talking about the New Testament church. The kind of compassion that's going to feed people spiritually, that's going to make the church grow, make it prosper, and make it be everything God desires it be. It's going to come about because we are people who learn to be compassionate and to care. You say, well, I'm compassionate. I care about those that are members of the church. What about folks that are not? I care about those that are entrusted in my care. What about folks that are not? How can I look upon anyone and see them in need and not be compassionate and still call myself a Christian? I don't believe it's possible. People want to know that we care. Good leaders care because they are filled with compassion. And compassion, when practiced in New Testament principles, means that I am equally compassionate to those who differ so much from me that I can't understand where they are and what they are and why they got where they are, as well as those who are exactly like me. Because in the end result, our goal is one thing and one thing only: to make sure that I get to a place called heaven, and in the process of making that journey myself, to make sure as many of you or whoever I can make that journey with me. That's what good leadership is all about. And if our focus is on self constantly, what's in it for me constantly, what's in it for those I owe constantly, We can never be like God. Is God a God of compassion? Most certainly so. Jesus went about doing good because Jesus, our Savior, was compassionate. When he healed those different folks in the multitudes, and he made them walk again, made them see again, cured them of leprosy, when he raised their dead back to life, why did he do it? It was an act of compassion. Certainly it confirmed him to be the Son of God, but he was moved with compassion. Good leaders are moved with compassion. We try to see what we can do to bring out the best in those around us. Moses had to tend to a flock of sheep. Do you know how dumb sheep are? Pretty slow. And yet, one of the dumbest animals there is when it comes to taking care of themselves. And yet, the Bible says, all ye, in other words, all we, like sheep, have gone astray. Think about what that means. There are many animals that God could have compared us to that would have been a compliment. Being compared to sheep, as far as our ability to stand on our own 2 feet, that's not a compliment. But yet all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned aside, everyone to our own way. We need somebody to lead us. Jesus came to lead. Jesus in turn imparted to us the opportunity to develop ourselves into good leaders. Natural born, learned. We don't just naturally know what to do when it comes to the salvation of our soul, or else we wouldn't go astray. We don't just naturally know what to do with the salvation of other souls, or lest we wouldn't allow them to go astray. But God takes us, He shapes us, He molds us. He conforms us into the image of Christ so that we begin to be, in time, prepared to be everything that God needs us to be leaders. Moses, in the second 40 years of his life, spent time as a shepherd, learning to be compassionate. And in the course of his labors there, he saw the bush that burned, which was not consumed, and he said, I will turn aside and see this sight. And there's where it all started. God is making him ready. He seeks an answer. Now all of a sudden he's seeking a solution. This wasn't a rash act. This was a reasonable act. He's going to turn aside and see this sight. He wants an answer. He wants a solution. Nothing rash here, but a deliberate choice. And every action that Moses took after he left Egypt was humbling. Because only humility could prepare him to truly lead. Only humility could cause him to see with the eye of compassion. And the eye of compassion leads us to demonstrate the care that is needed to guard those around us. Good leaders guard. Elders are to be overseers over the flock. We're to guard. We are to lead by example and by confirming and by upholding and by uplifting the Word of God. We need to be prepared. Compassion will lead us. It'll lead us to guard them, and it'll even lead us in times of danger if we're leaders. It'll cause us to not only guard them, but it'll give us the strength that we need when the time comes to defend those that are weak. Jesus was filled with compassion. But when it came time to defend those that were weak, Jesus was filled with anger. righteous anger, as he cast the money changers out of the temple. On several occasions, we saw the apostles stand firm in rebuke in the book of Acts. Because the time had come now to demonstrate the kind of compassion to guard those entrusted in their care that they had to defend with strength, with force, the force of words, the truth in those that had obeyed the gospel. Compassion. Compassion teaches us to value in others instead of just valuing in ourselves. The result? Well, Moses is now ready. 80 years. Can you imagine if I told you that I'm going to take you and we're going to work for 80 years? And then after 80 years, we're going to start working towards your reward. And oh, by the way, it's going to be 40 years before you get there. What would you say? Well, that's a bad deal. I'm going to labor for 80 years to get ready to labor for the reward that you're going to give me, and it's going to take 40 years to get that. But going back to what we read, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. What's it worth? What's it worth for us to give everything that we have, to devote our whole lives, knowing that the end lies ahead, but we don't know when. We don't know how long we're going to have to labor. We don't know how long we're going to have to suffer affliction. We don't know how long we're going to have to serve, but we know that God is going to reward us in the end. 80 years of experience necessary to perform 40 years of work. And yet God, through time, prepared him for his mission. And by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Though his speech was slow, though his choices were rash at first, and reactions were not well thought, with time, his life experiences led to Moses making good choices. And well thought out choices lead to good decisions when we think. To come to years was to make him ready to make decisions based on a lifetime of wisdom and experience. Mistakes, certainly, they were part of the process of learning. We're all going to make mistakes. But our response should always be different from a reaction, because good leaders learn through humility. And then they're qualified to be followed. When we begin to do things the right way, people pay attention. Humility, not a weakness. It's a strength. The world thinks it's a weakness, but it's a strength. And these patterns for success, if we'll read through the Bible, just casually, you don't even have to study it hard. If you'll read through the Bible just casually, you're going to find a multitude of men and women who in the course of their life made choices that sometimes were mistakes, but then turned around and made choices that were for God, that were always a success. We want to learn from their example, see their pattern, follow the course that they set, so that we can taste the wonderful reward that comes not only in this life, but especially in that life which is to come. If you might have a need in any way tonight to respond to the invitation, you could simply come now. All together, we stand and we say.